All right. Cool. This has been a very active week again, which makes it number N in a row, which makes me happy because we've made a lot of progress. I think that on REST core, there isn't much, but there is something to report. But maybe Wim can talk about that.
Actually, off the top of my head, I'm not sure that there is anything to report for core REST, unless I'm forgetting something from last week.
Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Dad.
I had a question about core REST, and it would actually affect JSON API, I think. So the issue, this issue with the, for those following along, it's 2300677. It's the one to add patch post. Was it patch post? Not delete, but we're going to take delete out of there. So I guess past and post and patch. And it's sort of blocked on the idea of validation at this point. So I think the last comment I made was suggesting that we switch from the idea of saying that I think the latest idea in that issue is to say like supports validation. But I think we might run into a problem where we actually want to have a particular entity support validation programmatically, but not actually expose it via patch or post, or be in the situation where anything that supports validation programmatically automatically gets exposed if we tie those two things together. So I'm wondering if we want to add an annotation that explicitly would be like API supported operations. And the idea with that would be that the default for content entities would be all the operations. The default right now for config entities would be Git, and then individually they could opt in as validation gets sorted out. Because otherwise, when we have the issue right now says we don't want to support delete because there's other problems with supporting delete. So if we just tie it to validation, then what do we do when we want to start supporting delete? Do we like add an annotation that says support delete validation, or do we make a, do we make an interface that's like delete validation interface or something like that? It just seems like we're tying it programmatically to the idea of validation when it's not. I don't think necessarily in the future we would want every single thing that we add validation interface onto to automatically be exposed to the API. I don't know if anybody had thoughts about that.
So I would say rather than complicate things with too many flags, isn't it possible for us to generically default every config entity type to disallow deleting via its access control handler? So essentially every config entity that does have complex dependency deletion problems. I agree that that's not a validation problem, but it's just like we haven't sorted this out, so we can't actually support this. So we could just say in the access control handler for the delete operation, not allowed, period, until we sort it out. And that way, then we don't have complexity leaking through via flags and via the REST module needing to configure things in a special way, JSON API needing to configure things in a special way. Then it is abstracted away into that entity type dealing with it.
So the entity type's access control handler?
Yep.
So do they actually know if it's REST or if it's a regular operation?
I don't think they do, and they shouldn't. But
I think we discussed this in the past, and actually we tried to not do the whole is internal thing by just leveraging the entity access, but it didn't turn out to be a good tool, because like we wanted to disallow, for instance, gets right on an entity type, and we thought, oh, then just do not grant view access to this. But programmatically, things happen under the hood that kind of check on that, and it's not just that you cannot do those kind of operations on the entity itself, but also programmatically as mid steps that need to happen for a greater scheme of things. And we kind of run away from that approach. That's why I was leaning towards what Ted was saying, and like
Because
we already added the is internal floodgate of sorts. Like it's all or nothing flag.
Yep.
Maybe we need a more granular kind of sub option that is more per, I don't want to say per method, maybe per operation. So GraphQL folks feel included because they are not REST. So per operation, maybe, and that kind of ties a little bit to something that Gabe and I discussed, but I don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But with that in context, Wim, do you still feel that adding it to the access control handler for the operation itself would be the best option?
So yeah, I don't think I was involved in all of these discussions, so maybe I don't have the full background that I need to have in order to have a complete enough picture to talk about these things as deeply and intelligently as we need to. But I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of entity API maintainers as well. And I don't think they are going to like adding flags for every single thing, for every possible thing. The intent is to keep things as simple as possible and to reuse as much logic as possible. I also think that in the existing configuration UIs where you can delete config stuff, I just grabbed the code base for arrow access delete. In other words, checking the delete operation on something. And I see not a whole lot of things turning up. So I actually think that much of the UI is not checking delete access because, as we know, config entities are kind of mostly UI driven, and they aren't necessarily implementing and supporting or using the full extent of the entity API. So I don't like, that seems to me to suggest that it is possible to do what I suggested, which would be the simpler approach to have it be applied everywhere. But I'm like, I can totally be wrong. But I'm just like, I doubt many people are going to like adding more complexity to the entity API. And especially even with the internal flag, it's been strongly opposed to add a flag that literally says something like expose via API. It needed to be something more generic, and I'm not sure how we're going to pull it off for something like this. I think what we should do is talk to the entity API maintainers, and specifically config entity API maintainer, and talk to them to what extent delete operation on config entities has already been used. What are the known gaps there? How do they want to see that evolve? Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, it totally makes sense. I think that the bottom line is that we have a missing feature that we may want, which is have write-only entities, or sorry, entity types, right, via the API, and we cannot do that because we either set it internal and nothing can happen, or we just allow everything once the validation is in place. So maybe add those annotations as an alter in another module, like.
But then how that won't work? Like, then every contrib entity type would need to be aware of this as well, and like it's a kind of unofficial entity API extension. Like that's.
So, I know. I'm trying to work around this.
I know. But that's the thing. Do we work around it, or do we solve it at the root? And like either way, it's going to take time. But eventually, we are going to need to solve it at the root for sure. But I see, for example, in media type form, it's checking the delete access operation on the media type entity. Media type entities are config entities. So apparently that particular entity type is doing it, but pretty much nothing else, none of the other config entity types are doing it. And so that to me suggests that probably this is something literally nobody has ever thought about before, because we haven't had the need until today, maybe, because nobody has been dealing with config entities in code. But remember, whatever we support in JSON API, REST, and GraphQL also is actually possible via PHP code. And PHP code currently doing deletions would run into the same problems that Ted is referring to with regards to dependencies. So at some point, we're going to need to solve those problems anyway.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
My only, I want to say strong feeling, because it's not that strong, but we should, if we move in the direction of having some dependency on top, or configuration on top, or specifying this granularity, we should try to investigate what the OpenAPI format is doing and how they are doing it, because as far as I know, REST, JSON API, GraphQL, and Relaxed Web Services both kind of look into this spec to define what you can do. And then we are certified to be compliant with OpenAPI, which is also something that we want. So that would be like a good way to get our requirements, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that if we did put it into the validation handler, then you could never document that you can't delete this particular entity type, because it would always be on the per entity basis.
Mm. That is a good point.
I didn't think about that till just now.
Yeah, that's the sort of metadata we often are lacking, right? As in,
Yeah.
for example, let's say even for nodes, if you want to edit a particular field, or for comments as well, for certain fields, they are meant to be read-only, and perhaps sometimes are only modifiable by an administrator. So you need a very strong permission, like administer nodes or administer comments. But that is logic that is buried inside of an access control handler. But we need it to be declarative in some way to be able to surface it in OpenAPI documentation. And so that's the same problem essentially. And that's an unsolved problem, because you need to execute logic in order to get there.
Yeah, totally. That's why I was trying to get ahead of this problem and think through the possible cases with that OpenAPI in mind, if this is going to be a exposed via API kind of solution.
So this is starting to sound like a entity access control handler next generation, as in it needs to be declarative, and you need to declaratively indicate by which axes you vary so that you can generate such documentation. But yeah, at this point, we should all be weeping and running away, because that's going to be a big undertaking.
No NGs started here.
So yeah, that's painful. That's rough. And then also on top of that, you can completely customize your access control logic per entity type, per operation, even for your particular site or for your control module. So even what we would document there could still, even if we declare it some way, it could still be overridden. So yeah, it would only work in its simplest case, such an annotation.
It's almost as if we just need a plain API module that REST, JSON API, and everything always just checks.
Can you explain that? I'm not sure I follow.
Well, I mean, we're tying the idea, I mean, the idea of what operations you can do on our entities are all, they seem like so tied to what you can do programmatically, but it seems kind of weird to do that in some sense, because I feel like what you want to expose to the outside world is often going to be different. Like the idea that you can't delete a write-only config type would probably be I could see that being write-only from an API standpoint, but not internally, obviously. You'll need to read that. But we don't really, doesn't seem like we really are ever on the road that we're going down, there doesn't seem like there will ever be a way to do that, because it's always tied to like what the entity itself knows about, which is, or what the entity declares, which is the same for programmatically and for the external API. But
isn't that what we always do anyway? Or are you saying we shouldn't be doing that always anyway?
Yeah, I don't know. I guess it's a larger discussion.
It's a good question, but yes, it's the whole point is that the whole point of JSON API and core REST is that we expose the things that you can do with the API that we use internally.
Yeah.
So that you can do it without having to write PHP code that is a Drupal module or interfaces with Drupal directly. And we could layer up on top of that additional things, but then, yeah, there's more things to maintain still and more complexity. Well, that's the thing, right? If you add that layer of complexity, it could simplify some things on the surface area, but then the code to have an identity type exposed via RESTful API is going to become more complex. So yeah, it's a two-edged sword, I guess.
Yeah, I'll have to look back at that I mean, Daniel had pinged me on this post-patch validation issue. And I can't remember where it stopped. I mean, when I looked at it the other day, I remember where it was sort of blocked at. But I'll have to go back and see. I feel like it's blocked, and there's maybe it's because I haven't looked at it in a while.
I'll take another look as well. Yeah, we need to get all the config entity validation stuff back on track because it affects everything. So definitely. Thanks for getting going again.
All right. Sorry, I was too interested in the conversation, lost track of the timer, and we have only 10 minutes left. Ted, is it too much to ask to kind of summarize the discussion that we had in the way that you want, even if you don't want to? I mean, sorry, not what I meant. It's okay if you don't want to and don't do it, but like put some lines on. We talked about this in the weekly meeting, and we thought, blah.
Yeah.
All right, that's awesome.
Yeah, awesome. All right.
So JSON API, good Lord, a lot happened, and we released security releases. We are now at 1.10, and that was some awesome work. Those were like hard to find and hard to fix in a proper way. And thanks to everyone involved, that was pretty great to see it happen. But also many other things happened, and most notably, you can now. Sorry, I don't want to take this on because I actually didn't write the code for these fixes. So maybe Gabe or Wim can do a kind of a summary of what happened this week in JSON API, what got committed.
I already talked too much, so either one of you should do it.
Honestly, what did you have in mind, Matteo?
No, just give a quick summary of the things that happened, like I don't know, the updates to the fields that you cannot change, but you need to send anyways, unchanged, and things like that.
I'm going to let you summarize. I honestly can't think of it off the top of my head. You obviously have some things in mind.
So, well, I have that one. You can send patches with fields that you don't have access to write on, as long as you write what's already in the entity. And that is because sometimes there are some weird cases where you want to have those fields in the patch document, but you don't have access to write them. But if it's the same value, we're kind of just skipping that. So that was one. Then more test coverage happened, and then which is like only a line, I know, in the summary, but it's a huge deal. More test coverage happens. Yay. Then, if I recall correctly, we can now disable entities by isInternal. And I'm not sure if this happened this week or last week, but we can do that. And we are doing it in JSON API extras. So JSON API extras allowed to define which resources were enabled in the past, and then core REST defined the way that you should specify it in the entity API level, much like what we were talking about a moment ago. And that trickles down to JSON API, but now we had JSON API extras doing it one way and JSON API expecting it to do it another way. So now they are both reconciled, and in the latest JSON API extras release, which is RC5, I think. I did like 4 releases this weekend. And
Did the config dependencies make it in?
Yes.
Awesome.
Yeah. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So it turns out that we were doing a normalization of config entities for reads incorrectly, and WIM's test coverage uncovered that. So now you can normalize and read any config entity properly and not lose data, which is really good. I think that's about it for the config normalization piece, right?
Yeah, I forgot about that one, and that one was probably the most outstanding of all. Well, maybe not. But anyways, that was still very interesting to see happen and to have it detected. And most importantly, we won't have a regression on this because we have test coverage. So
one thing that I don't think will affect most people, but it is worth bringing up, is that we no longer require access content permission for all routes. And so if people have like custom defined entities or something like that, where they were previously and wrongly just relying on that access content permission, those are exposed now.
Right. I can't recall anything else. That doesn't mean that nothing else happened. But luckily, there is the Git record if anyone is curious about it. WIM seems to have something else.
Oh, just wanted to mention that the dependencies thing, so the dependencies information was incomplete, or certain important deals were missing. That's not the only thing that was affected. There were also certain kinds of configuration structures that would also have the similar data lost. It's just a data structure normalization issue. And for the internal entity type stuff that Matteo mentioned, that is already, for example, in use by Drupal core for the content moderation module, which uses on the inside an entity, but it's never meant to be used by the outside world. So that's one example of an entity type that itself marks itself as internal, and it's now respected by core REST, JSON API, and hopefully soon GraphQL as well. And there will be more of these. For example, for the workflow workspace module is also going to do something like this. And there will be probably more cases like this. So it's great to have the entire ecosystem respect the same flags, and then everything behaves consistently. So you could easily, for example, if you started a decoupled site with REST, you can migrate over to JSON API and get similar data, and be sure that you're not missing anything, and be sure that the same sensitive data is not being exposed to people who shouldn't see it, and so on. So that's great.
Oh, sorry, muted. Then we randomly met in the Contenta channel, Gabe and I, and talked about some stuff. I think that is very challenging to kind of pack that in 3 minutes. We talked about a little bit more on what we talked last week on having kind of a UI to affect this type data metadata, in particular the isInternal, but also about some thoughts about API versioning, they are raw at this point, and I don't know if Gabe, do you want to wait for something to be more kind of cooked or stable in your head, or do you want to brainstorm a little bit?
I don't think in 3 minutes we can talk about it, but I'll reiterate just there are some very raw ideas around API versioning and how to do that in a way that I think solves a lot of the problems with kind of independent changes that different Drupal sites can make on a per site basis versus what's happening in core versus module updates, and kind of reconciling all that into a stable versioning strategy that clients can take advantage of.
Cool. I'm sure we will talk about that at some point more in depth. But that also happened, and then more simple auth. Some of the features that will empower additional contribs that will like gravitate towards SSO and using Drupal as the authorizer service for a variety of microservices. All those kind of things are kind of happening at the same time. Those are moving forward, but nothing extraordinary was committed this week. And we have 1 minute, but I'm willing to extend this for as long as we need to, because I see that there are 2 people that usually don't join these meetings, and I want to give them the floor if they want to talk about anything in particular, or just say hi.
Or have questions.
Oh, have questions, obviously. It is okay, be read only as well.
Yes. Or if you want to say, God, I wish this stupid bug didn't get in my way, something like that, totally fine as well. We need to know.
I mean, so I'm here. This is Rich, helping out with OpenAPI. I mean, we haven't made very much progress, but I usually forget the meetings happen because my calendar notifications haven't been working. But I mean, sounds like there's good progress going on.
Awesome. Good to meet you online.
Yeah, I was on a couple weeks ago, but
oh, cool.
Forgot about the calendar notifications, but it's all fixed now.
Don't worry about it. Like all of us occasionally skip one. It's fine if you skip many.
Hey gang, this is Justin, and I just wanted to say hi, and yeah, just listening in.
Hi, Justin.
Welcome.
Nice to meet you. And I think that I'm gonna take the chance if no one else has anything, to just finish the meeting on sharp 30 minutes, and this was all wrapped up, and it was a beautiful meeting. 31. That just changed. Okay, I'm gonna take it as well.
All right, thanks.
See ya.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.